It was on a certain evening in the year 1877, within a London drawing room scented faintly of lilies and warmed by the glow of gas lamps, that the Prince of Wales first beheld her. Edward, heir to the throne, accustomed to beauty and accustomed too to the jaded amusements of court, paused as his eyes fell upon a woman whose loveliness seemed at once fragile and imperious. She was called Lillie Langtry, and though still young, her face would soon be stamped upon the imagination of an entire age. Welcome, dear listener. Wherever you rest at this moment, whether in the hush of midnight or at dawn before the household stirs, know that you are part of a quiet fellowship across the world, a circle joined by memory and curiosity. If you find yourself carried along by these stories, I invite you to share when and where you are listening as part of this woven tapestry of remembrance. And if you wish to support this work, do remember to subscribe so our journeys may continue together. Now let us begin. The air in that Mayfair drawing room was heavy with the faint perfume of flowers, mingled with the sharp smoke of cigars and the murmur of voices moving in tides of laughter and polite disdain. There was little in the scene that had not been enacted 100 times before. Ladies in gowns of subdued but costly fabric reclined upon settees, their jewels catching the faint light as though to whisper their own stories of inheritance. Gentlemen, weighed with titles or offices, spoke too loudly of horses and bills in Parliament. Into such a setting, Lillie Langtry stepped, and something altered. Her presence did not enter noisily, nor was she dressed to outshine the others. A simple black gown, worn not out of vanity, but in mourning for her late brother, set her apart by its severity. Yet it was precisely this simplicity that made her stand clear of the frilled and jeweled throng. Her face, pale and finely shaped, with eyes of piercing blue, gave the impression of a portrait somehow animated and made flesh. Men fell silent when she spoke, though her words were not outrageous. What drew them was her self-possession, that elusive calm which spoke of a world beyond social striving. Among those who noticed was the Prince of Wales, Edward, son of Victoria, long married yet long restless, known already for his appetites and indiscretions. He was not a man easily surprised, but when his eyes turned toward Lillie, surprise indeed flickered across his features. It was not merely beauty, for he had known countless beautiful women. It was the suggestion of independence, as though here stood one who could not be entirely possessed by flattery or command. That such a woman might yield her attentions willingly, not out of calculation, was a novelty. The night wore on with the usual displays of wit and posturing, but the story of the evening lingered upon her. By the next day, whispers had already begun, carrying her name into salons and corridors. Who was this Jersey woman, this island-born beauty whose presence unsettled the prince himself? The answer was still vague, and perhaps it was the mystery that lent her first the aura of scandal. One wonders, in recalling this moment, whether she felt the weight of the gaze that fell upon her, or whether she drifted unknowing into the current of fate. Could she have foreseen that this encounter would shape her future, drawing her into the orbit of power where praise and ruin were offered with equal hand? Or did she, even then, sense the trembling line between admiration and danger? These questions remain, suspended like motes in the lamplight of memory. The drawing room itself faded at last into quiet, the guests dispersing into the night, carriages clattering upon the cobblestones, lamps flaring and dying in the damp London air. Yet the impression of her remained, as though the walls themselves had absorbed her likeness. A single lily placed in a vase near the window had begun to droop, its petals curling inward, and it seemed to hold some silent omen. That was the beginning. The evening when a prince and a woman from Jersey crossed paths, and the ripples spread outward into history. The candle flames wavered as though uncertain, their smoke curling like the uncertain road before her. And so ends this first glimpse, not with conclusion but with the flicker of light itself, poised between brilliance and shadow. The candle flames that lingered in the silence of that evening bent and swayed as though reluctant to vanish, and from their faint glow, the whispers began to travel. Whispers have always been the true currency of high society, slipping from lip to ear with the stealth of a cat in the night, leaving no trace yet, altering reputations with invisible claws. In Mayfair, where the gas lamps flickered over polished carriages and the parlors glowed with talk, the name of Lillie Langtry rode those whispers with uncommon speed. It was not only that she had captured the gaze of the Prince of Wales, though that alone would have been enough to set tongues wagging. It was also the manner of her presence, the stark black gown that refused frivolity, the clear eyes that met, stares without lowering, and the composure that seemed unlearned yet unshakable. People asked who she was, and others invented answers where knowledge was scarce. That night's gossip began softly, like the distant notes of a piano drifting through open windows, almost tender in its curiosity. But by the next morning, it gathered force. In the private breakfast rooms of Piccadilly, ladies speculated over her origins between sips of tea, their voices tinged with the thrill of novelty. In gentlemen's clubs thick with smoke, older men muttered about the boldness of the prince's admiration, while younger ones leaned in eagerly, asking questions, repeating what little was known. So quickly does the breath of curiosity turn into the fire of scandal, though the woman at its center may do nothing at all but breathe and exist. Yet what is scandal, if not fascination clothed in censure? The polite world of Victorian London was one that thrived on rules, yet adored nothing more than watching those rules bent. A lady who behaved correctly in every respect might be admired, but she would not be remembered. It was the one who drew too close to danger, who dared the edge of impropriety without falling entirely, who seized the imagination of the city. Lillie, whether she intended it or not, walked upon that edge from the very first evening. She seemed, in her silence and restraint, to understand the paradox, that one must both invite attention and disdain it, both charm and resist, both yield and hold aloof. The Prince of Wales himself was not blind to the effect. His attentions had made many women the subjects of whispered talk, yet with Lillie the quality was different. She did not fawn upon him, did not hang her reputation on his favor. Instead, she stood at his side as though it were her right, neither boastful nor shrinking. And perhaps this calm refusal to play the part expected of a royal mistress made her more alluring than any calculated performance could. One wonders whether the prince felt, at last, that here was a companion who offered not only beauty, but a mirror in which he could glimpse his own humanity, stripped for a moment of crown and expectation. And so the city spoke. Each whisper grew a little louder, each retelling more embellished. Some claimed that she had bewitched him, others that he sought merely to provoke his stern mother, the queen. Still others whispered of wagers placed in smoky rooms as to how long the affair might last. It is a strange feature of human nature that the private affections of two individuals become the entertainment of thousands, as though love and desire were not fragile things, but public spectacles to be dissected like curiosities under glass. Meanwhile, Lillie walked the streets of London with her usual composure, the carriages rattling past on rain-slick stones, their wheels throwing up the faint smell of damp horsehair and coal smoke. The city itself seemed to shift around her. Invitations arrived at her modest home with increasing frequency, doors that had once been closed to an obscure island woman now opening with polite urgency. At first she hesitated, as though uncertain of the path she trod, yet soon enough she accepted, not only because the invitations flattered, but because they offered something more elusive. the promise of a life beyond the narrow island childhood and the constrained marriage she had known. But even as she entered those gilded rooms, the whispers followed, invisible companions, testing her every step. To be admired was sweet. To be suspected was perilous. The two always traveled together, inseparable as shadow and light. One wonders if she lay awake at night listening to the faint tick of the mantel clock, wondering whether the admiration of a prince might in time become the ruin of a woman. Or perhaps she did not think at all of ruin, but only of the freedom that came with daring. It is difficult across the distance of years to say which thought carried greater weight. The letters and memoirs that survive speak of charm, of wit, of a beauty that drew men like moths to a flame. But rarely do they show the private reckoning of a woman who had stepped, almost unknowing, into a storm of fascination. Did she smile at the rumors, considering them part of the game? Or did she sometimes feel the weight of eyes upon her back, the judgment of those who envied and despised in equal measure? History leaves us to wonder, and perhaps it is best that it does. In any case, the whispers did their work. Within a season, her name was as familiar as that of any actress or singer. She had become a subject of conversation, a figure known more for what was supposed than for what was proven. To some, this was the highest form of success, to be talked of, to be noticed, to be indispensable to the gossip of the city. To others, it was a dangerous elevation, for the higher one is lifted by curiosity, the further one may fall when scandal hardens into condemnation. And so the nights continued, parlors filled with talk, the scent of lilies mingling with cigar smoke, the rustle of silks brushing against carpets. Outside, the rain fell upon the stones, and the carriages rolled through the damp London air, their wheels turning endlessly, as though carrying the whispers themselves from one house to another. The sound of those wheels became, in time, the rhythm of her days, each turn of the axle bearing her name a little further, weaving it into the great web of society where fascination and danger are one. The night closed again, the last carriages retreating into the mist, leaving behind only the echo of wheels on wet cobblestones. The city seemed to sleep, but in its dreams her name continued to pass, soft as breath, unstoppable as the tide. The sound of carriage wheels rolling across wet cobblestones lingers in the mind like a distant echo, rhythmic and ceaseless. And as the sound fades, it turns into another rhythm entirely, one older and more eternal, the crash of waves upon the rocky shores of Jersey. That is where her story truly began, long before London's parlors and royal whispers, upon an island marked by winds that seldom rested and seas that seldom forgave. It was in that austere beauty that Emily Charlotte Le Breton, later known as Lillie Langtry, first opened her eyes to the world. The island was small, but to a child it seemed vast, every lane twisting between hedges, every cliff opening onto an immensity of water. There was, in those landscapes, a mixture of isolation and grandeur, as though the earth itself whispered of both confinement and possibility. The sea ruled all, its salt carried on every gust of wind, its voice constant and unrelenting. To live in Jersey was to learn early that nature could be both a cradle and a stern tutor. The children of the island grew hardy, accustomed to the loneliness of distance and the sudden fury of storms. Lillie was the daughter of the Reverend William Corbet Le Breton, the Anglican dean of Jersey, a man of learning and authority, yet also of contradictions. His household was known for brilliance but also for scandal, for he was not immune to passions that sat uneasily with his clerical collar. The stories that surrounded him were whispered across the island, and perhaps it was here that Lillie first learned how reputation can be as sharp as truth, and how scandal is both a wound and a lure. From her mother, Emily Davis, came a gentler strength, a dignity of bearing that remained with Lillie long after childhood. The blend of parental influence, the restless fire of her father, the poised grace of her mother, seems to have been distilled within her, shaping a character that would one day fascinate London. Childhood in Jersey was not gilded. It was marked instead by the persistent winds rattling the shutters, the long walks along stony lanes, the sight of fishing boats returning with nets heavy or light, and the stern gaze of villagers who measured each family's conduct with unyielding eyes. Lillie grew accustomed to watching and being watched, to moving within a world where even small gestures carried weight. She was bright, quick of wit, and handsome in a way that drew attention even when she was little more than a girl. There are accounts of her climbing walls, racing through fields, laughing too loudly for the tastes of the island's stricter matrons. Already she carried within her a refusal to be confined entirely by custom. It is curious to imagine how the sound of waves striking rock might have echoed within her, leaving an impression not unlike the applause of a distant theater she would one day hear. The sea applauds and condemns all at once, crashing in approval, then retreating in silence. To a child it must have seemed eternal, reminding her that beauty could be cruel and that survival required poise. Was it here, in these windswept days, that she first learned to hold her head high, to walk as though she belonged even when the earth beneath seemed to shake? Such questions cannot be answered, yet the image lingers. A young girl standing on a cliff's edge, her hair swept by gusts, gazing not inward to the island, but outward to the horizon. There was education, of course. Lessons, tutors, the discipline of reading and recitation. But more powerful than any of these was the theater of daily life in a small island society. Every word spoken at church, every meeting at the market, every rumor repeated across the harbor became a part of one's story, embroidered and unescapable. Lillie observed, and in observing, she began to understand the performance that is society itself. She saw how her father's reputation both elevated and endangered the family, how admiration and condemnation were often neighbors at the same table. Perhaps without knowing it, she began to prepare for her own role upon a far larger stage. The years passed, and she grew into a young woman of striking presence, her features sharpened by clarity rather than ornament. Where others sought frills, she seemed to prefer simplicity, a quality that paradoxically made her appear grander. Suitors noticed, but she was not easily won. Her wit as quick as her smile, her refusals as graceful as her acceptances. To those who remembered her then, she seemed already to carry a light that was not entirely of the island. There are accounts of neighbors remarking that she seemed destined for something beyond Jersey, though what that might be, none could guess. And yet the island, with all its winds and waves, could not keep her forever. In time, she would marry Edward Langtry, a man of moderate means and artistic ambitions, and with that marriage she would step from the rocky shores into the broader world of England. But before that departure, Jersey had already done its work. It had shaped her into one who could endure scrutiny, who could live amid whispers without crumbling, who could hold herself upright as storms raged. The sea had taught her balance. The island had taught her resilience. The waves crash still against those rocks, and if one listens long enough, one might almost hear in them the faint echoes of a girl's laughter carried into the distance. Lillie, long before she was the Jersey Lillie, was simply a child of the island, standing at the edge of the sea, learning without knowing that the world beyond was waiting. The water foamed white upon the stones, endless, unyielding, and the sound of it lingers even now, carrying us forward into the next part of her journey. The waves do not cease, their rhythm steady, eternal, and as they break upon the shore, we leave her childhood behind, stepping with her into marriage and the first boundaries of a life that sought always to expand. The waves that broke endlessly upon the rocky shore of Jersey seemed at last to carry her outward, their rhythm becoming the slow pulse of another life. From the salt-stung air of the island, she passed into the quieter confines of a marriage, one that promised stability, yet soon revealed its narrowness. Edward Langtry was a man of gentle temperament, a painter with ambitions not great enough to shake the world, yet steady enough to attract a young woman who wished for escape from the gossip and severity of her father's household. To wed him was to step into a different room, quieter than the tempest of Jersey, but still a room whose walls pressed closely. Edward was known for his careful brush, his devotion to landscapes and the muted poetry of English fields. His canvases bore the tones of earth and sky, modest in scope, sincere in execution. In him, Lillie may have sought a kind of refuge, the promise that the turbulence of childhood might dissolve into a measured life. Their marriage in 1874 was marked not by fanfare, but by the sigh of inevitability. For a time, they lived as husband and wife with the simplicity expected of their station. Yet even in those earliest days, one may imagine that she felt the constraints of this union. The studio where he labored with oils and brushes was filled with the smell of turpentine, sharp and insistent, mingling with the slow drying of paint. To some, it might have been a sanctuary. To her, perhaps, it was already a cage, the air too thick, the days too narrow. She, who had stood upon cliffs gazing at horizons, now found herself within the confines of walls hung with unfinished canvases. The strokes upon those canvases captured the quiet of fields and rivers, but she was restless for movement, for currents beyond what a frame could hold. Still, there must have been tenderness. It is not right to erase the possibility that affection bound them in those first years. She accompanied him, supported his efforts, walked beside him through the social circles of modest artists and patrons. Their evenings would have been ordinary, filled with the scrape of a chair against wooden floors, the small comfort of a meal shared in silence, the occasional laughter at a remembered island tale. Yet in her heart, something larger stirred. She had not yet discovered the stage, nor the magnetism she would later wield, but she must have sensed it pressing against her days, an unnamed hunger. London awaited, though neither she nor Edward could have foreseen what that city would make of her. When they moved from the island to the metropolis, it was with the thought that his career might flourish there, among patrons who sought pictures for their drawing rooms. But it was not Edward's brush that would claim attention. Instead, it was Lillie herself, with her luminous face and quiet composure, who drew the eyes of society. Invitations began to arrive, at first out of curiosity, then out of insistence. She was introduced to drawing rooms brighter than any she had seen before, filled with the chatter of politics and the laughter of fashionable women. In such rooms, her simplicity became her strength. While others adorned themselves with color and ornament, she appeared often in unadorned gowns, her beauty framed by restraint. This, paradoxically, made her unforgettable. Where others strove, she seemed effortless. She did not speak too much, yet when she did, her wit was quick, her laugh genuine, and the company leaned toward her as though drawn by a current they could not name. The marriage that had begun in obscurity had now placed her in the light, though Edward himself receded into the background, more comfortable with his paints than with the sharp eyes of society. One imagines him in his studio, the smell of oils still clinging to the air, listening as carriages drew up to their door, as voices rose in welcome for his wife. Did he feel pride at her sudden prominence, or unease at how swiftly she eclipsed him? History leaves his inner life largely silent, but silence itself tells its story. A man whose wife became the obsession of princes must have known both admiration and bitterness. For Lillie, the marriage that once promised escape now threatened to confine her again, not with isolation, but with a role too small for the force of her presence. The paradox of those years is clear. She was bound in a marriage, yet it was that bond which delivered her to the stage of London society. Without Edward, she might have remained upon her island, a beauty unrecorded. With him, she entered the city, but it was she, not he, who was chosen by its gaze. The studio walls press close, but outside them stretched the wide avenues of London, glittering with gaslight, murmuring with possibilities. Was there sorrow in this? Did she look upon Edward's canvases with pity, knowing that his work would never command the admiration that her mere presence evoked? Or did she feel gratitude, recognizing that his quiet ambition had carried her into the orbit of a world where she could at last test her own? Again, history offers only fragments, and the rest is left to our reflection. The years of that marriage, though they would later unravel, remain an essential passage. They formed the threshold through which she stepped from obscurity to notoriety. They gave her the experience of walls and boundaries against which her spirit pressed until it found a way out. And within those walls, she refined the poise, the calm self-possession, the clarity of presence that would soon astonish London's most jaded eyes. The smell of drying oil paint lingers in this part of the story, sharp and inescapable, filling the dim studio where Edward worked, while beyond its door the city beckoned. It is that scent, pungent and unyielding, that we carry with us now as the room grows darker and the hours pass, guiding us onward to the salons of London, where glasses will soon clink and voices will rise in welcome for the woman who would be named the Jersey Lily. The smell of oil paint, so heavy in the dim studio, lingers like a veil upon memory. But beyond the door, another world waited, bright and restless, filled with the music of laughter and the clinking of glasses. From that studio where Edward bent over his canvases, the path led outward into London's salons, places where society gathered to see and to be seen, where every gesture was weighed and every word echoed beyond its utterance. It was here that Lillie began to discover her own stage, though it was not yet a theater of boards and curtains, but of parlors lined with mirrors and chandeliers. The salons of London were worlds unto themselves, gilded cages where wit and charm were traded as eagerly as jewels or estates. Each evening bore the faint scent of perfume mixed with the smoke of cigars, each conversation a performance in miniature. A misplaced remark could linger for weeks, repeated and reshaped, while a single clever turn of phrase might win an admirer more lasting than wealth. For Lillie, fresh from the narrow walls of Edward's studio, these rooms were at once daunting and exhilarating. She moved among people who had been born to such circles, who carried themselves with an ease born of generations of privilege. Yet from the moment she entered, something shifted. Her beauty, already remarked upon in quieter gatherings, seemed here to blaze more clearly, not because she adorned it, but because she did not. Against a room filled with women glittering in colored silks and layered jewels, Lillie often chose plain gowns, most often black or white, and let the clarity of her form speak for itself. It was a boldness born not of arrogance but of instinct. In her restraint, she seemed at once more natural and more striking than those who competed with ornaments. The clinking of glasses followed her as men gathered and women turned their heads, not always in welcome, but always in recognition. It was not only her face that held attention, but her manner. She was unhurried in speech, listening more than talking. Yet when she did speak, her wit was keen, sometimes lightly barbed, yet never cruel. There was no trace of the nervous striving that so often marked newcomers to society. Instead, she carried herself with the calm of one who did not need to prove her worth. This composure, perhaps learned in the sharp gaze of island villagers and hardened in the confines of her father's scandalous household, became her shield and her weapon. In salons where gossip was the air itself, composure was rare and therefore prized. The Prince of Wales, already stirred by that first evening when he had seen her, soon ensured her invitations multiplied. His presence by her side gave her immediate consequence, but it was her own grace that secured her place. Others had enjoyed the attentions of Edward, but they often vanished quickly, consumed by their own vanity or undone by envy. Lillie endured, not by clinging, but by appearing always to stand slightly apart, a guest who belonged without ever seeming to beg for belonging. This paradox, at once near and distant, made her irresistible, and so glasses clinked. Toasts were raised in her honor, sometimes openly, sometimes slyly, as though mocking the very scandal they celebrated. Behind fans and under mustaches, voices speculated about her, and her name rippled outward through London. To be the subject of gossip is a dangerous gift, for it gives visibility and yet lays snares at every step. Did she relish the sound of her own name upon the lips of strangers, or did she hear in it the faint echo of the island's whispers, knowing how swiftly admiration can turn? Perhaps she carried both feelings within her, as one carries both pride and fear upon a high ledge. Edward Langtry, the painter, was seldom spoken of in these rooms, though his name still clung to hers by the bond of marriage. Some pitied him, others ignored him. To many he was little more than the shadow from which she had stepped. Yet he endured quietly, retreating further into his studio as his wife entered the radiant circle of society. The clinking of glasses that marked her evenings was absent from his days, replaced instead by the steady scratch of brush upon canvas. In this way, the distance between them grew, though perhaps it had always been there, hidden in the very difference of their desires. But for Lillie, the salons were more than entertainment. They were education. In them she observed how influence flowed, how power was exercised not only in Parliament, but in whispers and glances, in the favor of a royal, in the laughter of a duchess. She began to understand the subtle mechanics of reputation, how to preserve mystery, while offering just enough of herself to keep others hungry for more. It was a form of theater without script or curtain, where she learned to hold her audience with no more than a gesture or a pause before speaking. The clinking of glasses, at first flattering, became a rhythm in her ears, as steady as the waves she had left behind. Each glass raised in her presence was a signal that she had entered another circle, that she had been claimed by London society. Yet it was also a reminder that the same hands that lifted those glasses in admiration might one day let them fall in disdain. Such is the nature of society's applause, as fleeting as the bubbles rising in champagne. Still, the nights shimmered with possibility. There is in the memory of those gatherings a sense of light and motion, of mirrors reflecting her image endlessly, of chandeliers scattering brightness across silk and satin. Lillie walked among it with that same calm presence that had first astonished the prince, and though whispers trailed her, she gave them no answer, allowing silence itself to magnify their weight. In time, she would become more than a guest in such rooms. She would become a legend, spoken of as though she were less a woman than an emblem, the Jersey Lily. But for now, she remained a presence both admired and doubted, her name repeated with clinking glasses, her image lingering in mirrors long after she had left. The air of those rooms was heavy with smoke and perfume, the sound of laughter swelling and fading, and in that sound her story continued to rise. The glasses clinked again, bright in the night, and their echo carried forward, leading us onward to the moment when admiration hardened into a title, when she herself would become the Jersey Lily, a living portrait admired as though she were art itself. The echo of glasses clinking lingers in the air, fading slowly like the last notes of a violin at the close of a gathering. And in that lingering sound we find the moment when Lillie Langtry ceased to be merely a guest in London salons and became instead the Jersey Lily. The name was not her own choosing, yet it clung to her as surely as if it had been inscribed at birth. It began with a portrait, for society that adored her beauty sought to preserve it, and in preserving, to name it. An artist, struck by her clear features and luminous presence, compared her to the purity of a lily, and soon the phrase passed from brush to tongue, from tongue to newspaper, until it belonged to her as completely as her face. To be likened to a flower was hardly unusual in Victorian society, where women were often pressed into the fragile language of petals and blossoms. But in her case, the name became an emblem. The lily was not merely delicate. It carried with it associations of purity and aloof beauty, of something that could be admired but not possessed. That suited her perfectly, for she was admired fiercely, yet remained curiously apart, never surrendering herself entirely to the role others fashioned for her. She was not the rose whose thorns are expected, nor the violet, hidden and modest. She was the lily, pale and upright, standing in still water, reflecting light, but never entirely merging with it. The title, once spoken, was repeated endlessly, until she was rarely called by her given name at all. To be the Jersey Lily was to be more than a woman. It was to be an image, a symbol, an idea projected upon her by all who gazed. Some saw purity, others temptation, still others the embodiment of scandal itself, wrapped in beauty so serene it disarmed judgment. In salons, in prints, in conversations, the name followed her, and with it the paradox that would define her life. To be both subject and object, both actress and painting, both living and myth. It was in these years that she learned how to wear admiration like a garment. She did not resist the title thrust upon her. She wore it lightly with a smile that suggested she understood its absurdity even as she accepted its power. When she entered a room, conversations paused as though the air itself had shifted, and yet she seemed unhurried, unbothered by the weight of such scrutiny. It is tempting to believe that she enjoyed the role, that she found in it a kind of freedom, but there may also have been unease. For what does it mean to be turned into a flower, lovely yet motionless, admired yet constrained? The salons became stages where she played this role, though she never admitted to acting. Men admired her and sought her favor. Women scrutinized her with both envy and curiosity, noting every choice of gown, every word left unsaid. Lillie responded with a composure that appeared effortless, but was perhaps carefully measured. She neither courted nor rejected admiration, allowing others to project their desires and judgments upon her while she remained poised. This ambiguity gave her a power that no overt assertion could have, to be defined by others yet remain indefinable. That was her peculiar gift. It was during this time that she began to move more closely into the orbit of the Prince of Wales. His attentions, once discreet, grew more visible, and with them, the whispers grew louder. To be adored by the heir to the throne was no small thing. It was both elevation and peril. Yet Lillie carried the title of Jersey Lily into that relationship, so that even in scandal she appeared untouchable, as though the purity of the flower shielded her from censure. The irony, of course, was that the lily of the garden, so seemingly pure, blooms in the damp earth, its roots hidden in murky water. Was there in this image a hint of the truth, that purity and scandal are never so far apart as they appear? Her fame began to extend beyond London, her portrait reproduced, and her likeness sought after by artists and admirers alike. Cards, prints, and stories carried her image outward, and even those who had never seen her in person spoke of her as though she were a familiar figure. She became one of the first women to embody what we now call celebrity, known not only for her deeds, but for her very existence. This, too, she bore with calm, though one cannot help but wonder what she thought when she saw her face reproduced endlessly, no longer her own, but the property of the crowd. Did she feel herself dissolving into the image, or did she hold fast to some inner self, untouched by the gaze of others? The lilies themselves, those pale blooms so often placed in her presence, became silent witnesses. Bouquets were sent to her, their fragrance filling the air of her rooms, their petals curling and falling within days. She, however, remained luminous, her beauty seeming not to fade but to grow sharper with time. Perhaps she learned something from the flowers, that to wither is inevitable, but to hold the gaze of the moment is to seize eternity, however briefly. The salons, heavy with perfume and filled with mirrors, reflected her endlessly, and in each reflection she became slightly less a woman and slightly more a legend. It is difficult to say whether she guided this transformation or merely allowed it, but in either case, it defined her. To be the Jersey Lily was to live both within and beyond herself, to be at once admired and imprisoned by admiration. And so, the bouquets wilted in the night air, their fragrance lingering long after the petals had fallen. The image of the lily, upright and serene, hung suspended in the minds of all who saw her. From this moment, her path could only lead deeper into the entanglement of admiration and scandal, toward the affair with the prince that would seal her place in history. The night closes upon the sight of lilies wilting, their pale forms fading into shadow, and it is into that shadow that we follow her now, toward secret doors and whispered meetings, toward the silence that falls when a door is closed and a royal presence enters unseen. The image of lilies wilting in the night air drifts into shadow, their petals pale against the darkness, and out of that shadow emerges the silence of a door closing softly, the kind of silence that suggests secrecy. It is here that we step into the private chambers of history, where admiration transformed into intimacy, and where the affair between Lillie Langtry and the Prince of Wales began to unfold. There are no precise records of the first night, no letters that speak with candor of its beginning, for such matters are always cloaked. Yet the silence after that door closed has been preserved in the imagination of an age, repeated in whispers, recorded in memoirs, and embroidered in gossip until it became inseparable from truth. To be the mistress of the prince was no uncommon fate in Victorian society, for Edward, known familiarly as Bertie, had long sought companionship beyond the confines of his marriage. Yet in Lillie, the relationship seemed different, and this difference was noted by all who observed. Where other affairs were fleeting or tawdry, Lillie's held a strange dignity. She was not hidden away, nor did she seem overwhelmed by the weight of his attentions. She stood beside him as though it were her right, and in doing so, transformed what might have been scandal into something resembling partnership. It is tempting to imagine those first private meetings. The prince, heavy-set yet magnetic, shedding the stiffness of his public role, speaking in a voice relieved of protocol, and Lillie, serene and poised, neither fawning nor cold, listening with the same calm presence that had once silenced salons. What did they speak of behind closed doors? Was it the affairs of state, the endless burden of royal duty? Or was it laughter at the absurdities of court, a shared weariness of expectations, the small comfort of companionship in lives lived under constant scrutiny? We cannot know, and perhaps it is better not to, for the mystery itself has become part of their story. The affair quickly became more than rumor. They appeared together in public, attending dinners, sharing excursions, their proximity undeniable. Carriages bore them through the streets, and though discretion was observed, no veil is ever perfect when eyes are eager to pry. Society knew, and yet society did not wholly condemn. For the prince, indulgence was expected, and for Lillie, admiration had already made her untouchable. The title of Jersey Lily shielded her, giving her a purity that even scandal could not fully erode. yet admiration and peril walk hand in hand. To be loved by a prince was to rise beyond imagination, but it was also to live under the shadow of constant attention. Every gesture was noted, every absence speculated upon, every rival watched with suspicion. Did she feel the thrill of this elevation, or the burden of it pressing upon her shoulders? Perhaps both, for the sweetness of intimacy was balanced by the bitterness of endless scrutiny. There are accounts of evenings when she dined at Marlborough House, the prince's residence, amid glittering company, her presence acknowledged but not named, her seat a silent declaration of favor. In those rooms, filled with smoke and the faint clatter of silver on porcelain, she held herself with the same composure as in any salon, her smile unhurried, her voice measured. She gave no fuel to scandal, yet scandal thrived nonetheless, nourished by the very fact of her calm. For in a world where women were expected to flutter or fall, her refusal to do either was more provocative than any open display. But behind the splendor of dinners and the luxury of carriage rides lay the quiet truth of dependency. She was not royal nor wealthy in her own right. Her position, though radiant, rested on the favor of a man whose attentions might one day shift. Was she aware of this fragility? It is difficult to believe she was not, and perhaps it was this awareness that later spurred her independence, her refusal to let scandal define her future. For now, though, she moved within the golden circle, admired, envied, and whispered about, the sound of her name entwined with that of the prince. The relationship lasted not for weeks, but for years, longer than most had expected. Their bond survived the constant hum of gossip, the inevitable rivalries, the criticisms of those who disapproved. And in its endurance, it became something more than scandal. It became a legend, a chapter in the history of an age when appearances mattered more than truth, and when truth itself was often a performance. Was there love in it? That question has haunted biographers and readers alike. Love, that most fragile of words, is seldom preserved clearly in history. There was surely affection, companionship, admiration. Whether it reached the depth of passion or remained at the level of convenience, only they could have known. But in the silence of that closed door, one senses not merely desire but recognition, as though each found in the other a reflection of longing, he for a woman who would not treat him as crown first, man second, and she for a companion who could offer her the stage of influence she sought. And so, the years passed, each marked by evenings together, by appearances that confirmed what was whispered but never fully spoken. The affair did not end in ruin, nor did it culminate in fairy tale elevation. It lingered, then softened, as such relationships often do, giving way to new attachments, new scandals, but leaving behind an indelible mark upon both their lives. For Edward, she became one of the most memorable of his many companions. For Lillie, he became the emblem of her transformation from island child to figure of history. The silence after the closing of that secret door lingers still, echoing through time. It is in that silence that we leave this part of her story, aware that doors, once opened, lead always to new chambers. And so the silence now gives way to the scratching of quills upon parchment, the sound of letters written and exchanged. For in those rooms of power where Lillie walked beside princes and statesmen, words carried as much weight as presence, and her influence would extend beyond intimacy into the realm of politics and persuasion. The silence of a closed door becomes, in time, another sound, the faint and steady scratching of quills upon parchment, the rhythm of words being shaped into instruments of persuasion. Letters, discreet yet powerful, pass between men of influence, and in more than one of these exchanges, the name of Lillie Langtry appeared, not always written directly, but implied in turns of phrase, in the careful courtesies that spoke of her presence. For when she became the mistress of the Prince of Wales, she did not remain confined to the realm of romance or scandal alone. She entered quietly but unmistakably into the sphere where politics and power were decided, into the rooms where decisions that shape nations were framed in words rather than decrees. It was in Marlborough House, the prince's residence, that she was most often seen, moving among statesmen, generals, ambassadors, and courtiers. There, in rooms lined with portraits of ancestors and heavy with the scent of cigars, she carried herself with the same composure that had disarmed society in London's salons. She did not seek to dominate conversation, yet when she spoke, her wit and clarity cut through the haze of smoke and the murmur of debate. Men who dismissed women as mere ornaments found themselves pausing when she addressed them, struck by the intelligence beneath her beauty. Her influence was not overt, for she did not hold office nor wield any official title. Yet history has always known the power of presence, the way a whispered suggestion delivered at the right moment can shift decisions as effectively as a decree. Lillie's presence softened the atmosphere around the prince, making his gatherings less stiff, more human, more open to frank conversation. Diplomats who might have struggled to reach him through official channels found him more approachable in her company, more willing to listen when she smoothed the way with a smile or a quiet remark. There are hints, though seldom confirmed, that she carried letters on behalf of others, that she spoke in favor of causes or individuals, her words reaching ears that otherwise might have remained closed. If true, then her role was more than ornamental. She became a subtle conduit, a channel through which influence flowed. Whether she recognized this power fully is uncertain, but it seems unlikely that a woman of her perception could have missed it entirely. She may not have sought to shape policy, yet she surely understood the value of her position, the way her companionship opened doors that others could only knock upon. The whispers that once marked her as scandal now deepened into something more complex. Was she merely a mistress, a figure of beauty at the side of a prince, or was she something rarer, a woman who, without title or wealth, carved a place in the machinery of influence through grace and intelligence alone? The Victorians did not answer these questions openly, but their fascination with her presence betrays the unease such ambiguity provoked. A mistress could be dismissed, but a mistress who listened, who remembered, who spoke with wit, was more difficult to categorize. One can imagine her seated in those richly furnished rooms, a quill in her own hand, composing letters of her own. Perhaps they were notes of thanks, tokens of politeness, or playful replies to admirers. Perhaps at times they were messages of greater weight, urging favor for a friend or leniency for one who had fallen from grace. The sound of her pen across paper, steady and precise, becomes in the imagination as important as the scratching of quills by statesmen. For words once written travel farther than voices, and the hand that holds the pen directs the course of more than one destiny. Yet with influence came danger. To be seen as a participant in political circles was to invite suspicion. Some envied her nearness to power, others resented it, muttering that beauty had no place in affairs of state. And though no evidence exists that she overstepped, the possibility itself was enough to trouble those who preferred women silent. The balance she maintained was delicate. She must be present, yet not too present, influential, yet not commanding, admired, yet not envied beyond forgiveness. That she walked this narrow path without ruin is a testament to her instinctive understanding of human nature. But what of her own thoughts in these moments? Did she see herself as a figure of consequence, as someone shaping events, however subtly? Or did she remain inwardly detached, aware that her place in these rooms was conditional, resting upon the favor of one man, and therefore fleeting? Perhaps she held both views, as a sailor holds both awe and fear of the sea, knowing its generosity one day may become its cruelty the next. Still, the gatherings continued, the quills scratched, and her name passed quietly among those who held power. She was there when treaties were discussed, when alliances were considered, when gossip of foreign courts was traded like coin. The prince valued her company not only for her beauty, but for the ease with which she navigated these circles, her laughter softening the stiffness of men too accustomed to their own importance. And so, her legend grew, not merely as a mistress, but as a presence, a force both admired and feared, the lily whose fragrance lingered even in the chambers of politics. The image that closes this part of her story is not one of scandalous embrace, but of a quill poised above parchment, the ink glistening in lamplight as words of consequence are chosen carefully. It is the image of her listening as men debate, her eyes calm, her presence altering the very timbre of the room, though she speaks little. It is the sound of influence carried not in proclamations, but in whispers, in the faint scratching of pen, on paper that changes more than it admits. And from that sound, we move onward, for the scratching of quills becomes in time another sound, the rustle of heavy curtains being drawn aside, the rising murmur of a crowd gathering in a theater, and the daring step she would take upon an entirely new stage, transforming scandal itself into art. The rustle of curtains being drawn aside follows naturally after the faint scratching of quills, as though the paper of politics and the fabric of the stage were cut from the same cloth. And so the scene shifts from rooms of power to the theater, where lamps hissed above velvet draperies and where the murmur of anticipation swelled like the sea before a storm. It was here, in a place far removed from the sanctity of salons and the secrecy of private chambers, that Lillie Langtry chose to step openly before the public gaze, not merely as a mistress or a social ornament, but as an actress. This decision was nothing less than audacious, for in Victorian England the stage was both fascination and peril, a space of glamour tainted by suspicion, a world admired from afar yet regarded with moral unease. For a woman of society to step upon it was to cross an invisible line, to court both admiration and censure. The first time she appeared upon the stage, the atmosphere itself seemed to shift. The curtain parted, and there she was, no longer merely the Jersey Lily seated in salons, but a figure of art, framed not by chandeliers and mirrors, but by painted sets and the expectation of an audience. The silence that met her entrance was not the silence of scandal, nor of secrecy, but of collective awe. For her beauty, which had so often been likened to a painting, was now alive, moving, speaking lines with clarity and confidence. The audience, long accustomed to seeing her image in portraits and prints, now saw her breathing before them, a living embodiment of fascination. Her choice to act was more than a whim. It was a deliberate claiming of agency. In society, she was admired but passive, the object of others' conversations, the subject of gossip she could not control. On the stage, however, she could turn her presence into profession, her beauty into livelihood, her scandal into performance. She stood upon those boards not as the possession of a prince, but as a woman declaring herself capable of shaping her own destiny. This transformation was radical, and it did not go unnoticed. Some applauded her courage, others condemned her shamelessness, but all acknowledged her daring. The theater itself was a world of contrasts. Behind the curtain, the smell of paint, sweat, and dust mingled in the wings, while on stage the illusion of grandeur held sway. Lillie learned quickly the art of this transformation. She rehearsed, studied, and practiced, determined not to be dismissed as merely a dilettante trading upon fame. Her performances, though never regarded as the pinnacle of dramatic art, were praised for their sincerity and for the natural grace she brought. Critics, reluctant to embrace her fully, admitted nonetheless that she possessed a presence few could rival. Audiences adored her, not only for her beauty, but for the sense that they were witnessing a woman reclaiming herself. In this period, the applause of the theater replaced the clinking of glasses in salons. The sound was louder, more democratic, more dangerous. For society's applause could be withdrawn in private without consequence, but the theater's audience, if displeased, could condemn openly with silence or jeers. Each night she stepped upon the stage, she risked not only embarrassment but the collapse of her carefully built reputation. That she endured and indeed thrived speaks to the strength beneath her elegance, to the courage that few expected beneath the serenity of her demeanor. And yet, was it truly courage or necessity? For by the time she took to the stage, her affair with the prince had begun to fade, his attentions drifting toward others, as they so often did. Without his favor, her position in society could easily have crumbled. The theater offered not only a stage but a safeguard, a way to turn her notoriety into independence. To act was to survive, to secure her own means, to prove that she was not merely an ornament discarded when novelty waned. In this light, her choice appears less as a leap of vanity and more as an act of survival cloaked in grace. Still, survival alone does not explain the fascination she inspired. For in stepping onto the stage, she seemed to embrace the paradox of her life, that she was both spectacle and reality, both admired and condemned, both fragile and unyielding. She turned the whispers of scandal into applause, the image of the Lillie into a performance that could not be dismissed. Each gesture, each line spoken upon the boards was both theater and truth, both mask and revelation. Audiences, whether they admitted it or not, saw not only the character she played, but the woman herself, and in that recognition lay the power of her performances. It is said that when the curtain fell and the applause rose, she would bow with a composure that echoed her earliest appearances in salons, calm, almost detached, as though she were observing herself from afar. Perhaps in those moments she understood fully what she had achieved, that she had transformed scandal into art, dependence into profession, beauty into capital. Few women of her time managed such a metamorphosis. Fewer still endured it with dignity. The theater tours that followed carried her name across the country and later across oceans, spreading her fame far beyond London. Each new city brought fresh audiences, fresh applause, fresh whispers. Some came to admire her skill, others to gaze upon the woman who had captivated a prince. All left having witnessed the rare spectacle of a woman who had taken control of her own story, if only for an evening. The curtain rustles again in memory, the lights dim. The applause rises and falls like waves upon a distant shore. And in that fading sound, we are left with the image of her standing at center stage, luminous, serene, holding the gaze of thousands not by scandal alone, but by the quiet power of presence. From that echo of applause, we follow her onward, across seas and continents, for the sound of clapping hands fades into the rolling wheels of trains and the dust of foreign roads. It is there, in distant lands, that she would continue her performance, carrying her legend beyond England into America and beyond. The applause fades into distance, its echo dissolving like surf upon a shore, and in its place comes another sound, steady and metallic, the rolling of train wheels, the hiss of steam, the rumble of journeys stretching across oceans and plains. From the theaters of London, where she had first claimed her stage, Lillie Langtry carried her presence outward into the vastness of America. It was not exile, though some might have thought of it so. It was expansion, a widening of the circle of admiration and curiosity, a continuation of the transformation that had already made her more than scandal, more than beauty, more than mistress. She was becoming unmistakably a phenomenon. America in the late 19th century was hungry for spectacle. Its cities swelled with new wealth, its citizens eager for glimpses of refinement imported from Europe. For them, the arrival of the Jersey Lily was not merely entertainment. It was a visitation, a brush with the legend they had read of in newspapers, seen in illustrated prints, whispered about in parlors. When she stepped upon stages in New York, Boston, Philadelphia, or later in Chicago and San Francisco, audiences gathered not only to hear lines spoken, but to see with their own eyes the woman who had enchanted a prince. The sound of their applause was different from that of London, less restrained, less polite, more thunderous, born of unfiltered enthusiasm. Travel itself became part of her legend. Carriages bore her through crowded streets. Trains carried her across endless stretches of land where the windows opened onto prairies and deserts, and her name traveled faster than she did, announced ahead in posters and broadsides. Each destination bore the faint smell of dust and coal smoke, each new theater a blend of grandeur and rawness, some still half-finished, their rafters smelling of fresh paint and timber. Yet wherever she arrived, the people came, eager to see in person the woman whose beauty was said to silence rooms. Her performances remained much as they had in England, graceful, poised, marked less by technical mastery than by presence. Critics in America echoed those at home, sometimes begrudging in their praise, but always acknowledging her allure. Audiences, however, cared little for critical niceties. They applauded because they felt they had been in the presence of someone whose fame had crossed an ocean, someone whose life seemed a story larger than any stage play. The theater became, in a sense, a frame around her, and she the portrait within it. Yet beyond the applause, the journey must have held other meanings for her. To leave England, even temporarily, was to step outside the boundaries of gossip that had once constrained her. In America, she was not the scandalous mistress of the Prince of Wales, not the subject of London's jealous whispers, but simply Lillie Langtry, the Jersey Lily, a celebrity in her own right. Did she feel freer there, riding trains across landscapes vast enough to dwarf reputation? Or did she feel the loneliness of distance, the awareness that fame, however loud, is always a fragile shield against isolation? The answer, as so often in her life, lies in ambiguity, for she seemed to carry both feelings with her, serene upon the surface, restless beneath. The image of her traveling across the continent is vivid still, seated in a private carriage, gazing out at plains that stretch to the horizon, her reflection flickering in the window glass, half woman, half apparition. The clatter of the train wheels, steady and unending, must have echoed like applause that never ceased, a reminder that movement itself had become her companion. In letters and recollections, she spoke occasionally of the vastness of the land, the endless sky, the peculiar thrill of being far from the places that had first defined her. Perhaps she sensed that in these open spaces, she was rewriting herself once again, shedding the confines of island, marriage, and court, and becoming something less easily contained. Of course, the tours also brought challenges. Travel was grueling, the demands of performance relentless, the scrutiny of new audiences unyielding. The dust of American roads clung to clothes. The nights in strange lodgings offered little comfort, and the constant repetition of roles risked weariness. Yet she endured, as she had endured before, with composure intact. If fatigue touched her, she did not show it upon the stage, where every entrance seemed deliberate, every line measured, every bow serene. There is also the matter of wealth. These tours were not merely for glory, they were for income, for independence. Each ticket sold, each performance given, added to her financial security, enabling her to live not as a dependent mistress, but as a woman with means of her own. In America, she found not only applause but money, and with money came a different kind of freedom. It was the foundation upon which she would later build her ventures in racing, in property, in independence hard-won. The dust that clung to the wheels of her train was also the dust of gold, gathered with each mile. And so the applause of America joined the applause of England, swelling her legend, stretching her story across oceans. She became not only a figure of British society, but an international icon, one of the first whose fame traveled without the aid of cinema or radio, born instead on newspapers, prints, and the sheer force of curiosity. Her name, spoken in accents different from her own, became a bridge between continents. The tours ended, as all tours do, with farewells and returns. She crossed the ocean once more, the sound of waves recalling the island where her story had begun. But she was not the same woman who had left. She returned richer, more secure, more certain of her power. She had faced audiences vast and unfamiliar, and they had applauded. She had faced distances immeasurable, and she had endured. The Jersey lily had bloomed across an entire continent. Her legend carried in the dust of trains and the cheer of crowds. And as the train wheels rolled to a final halt, their dust settling into silence, another sound emerged, quieter yet sharper. The dry whisper of legal papers, the rustle of documents that would mark the dissolution of her marriage. For the freedom she sought upon the stage and across the seas would soon demand a price, and that price was the severing of the bond she had once hoped would grant stability. The dust of train wheels settles, fading into stillness, and in that stillness another sound emerges, the dry whisper of legal papers turned and folded, their edges sharp with finality. These were the documents that carried the end of her marriage, the quiet severing of vows once spoken with hope in a Jersey church. For Lillie Langtry, who had traveled from island to city, from salons to theaters, the next stage of her journey led her not to crowded parlors or applauding halls, but to a desert far removed from England's damp and America's clamorous streets. It was Nevada, with its barren horizons and sparse habitations, that offered her what the courts of London would not, the possibility of divorce. Divorce in the Victorian world was a thing fraught with peril. For men, it could be endured, their reputations only slightly shadowed. But for women, it carried stigma that clung like dust, marking them as fallen, untrustworthy, or worse. To seek it required courage and the willingness to stand against custom as much as against a spouse. For Lillie, whose life had already defied expectation, it became both necessity and liberation. Edward Langtry, the quiet painter, had long since receded into the margins of her story, a figure who could not keep pace with her transformations. Their lives, once joined, had diverged beyond repair. Yet the bonds of marriage remained, and to break them, she needed the peculiar laws of Nevada, where residency of a few months could suffice to dissolve what in England would take years of scandalous litigation. So she journeyed west, across plains where the sky stretched vast and unbroken, across mountains where the winds howled through canyons, into a land that seemed at once empty and immense. Virginia City, Reno, Carson City, names that carried the scent of dust and mining camps, of saloons and frontier justice. Here, among the remnants of the gold rush, where fortunes were made and lost with a single strike of a pick, divorce had become another kind of commerce, a trade in broken vows. Lillie took her place among others who came seeking release, their names less known, their stories less recorded, yet all bound by the same desire: freedom. It must have been strange for her, accustomed to gilded salons and velvet-draped theaters, to find herself in the raw air of the desert, where nights were sharp with cold and days burned with relentless sun. Yet perhaps in that barrenness, she found a clarity that cities had denied her. The silence of the Nevada landscape was different from the silence of drawing rooms. It was not filled with whispers or hidden eyes, but with wind and emptiness. To walk there was to feel small, yet also to sense possibility. One imagines her standing beneath the wide sky, her black gown catching the dust, her gaze steady upon horizons that seemed to promise renewal. The proceedings themselves were prosaic. Papers signed, testimonies given, the formalities of law observed with little ceremony. Edward did not contest, and soon the bond was dissolved. With the whisper of those documents, her marriage was ended, and she stood once more unbound, though not unscarred. Divorce may have granted freedom, but it carried, too, the weight of judgment. In England, tongues wagged with fresh vigor, repeating her name with tones of censure, as though a woman who dared claim her independence was more scandalous than one who merely yielded to passion. Yet she did not falter. Having faced the scrutiny of princes and crowds, she could withstand the gossip of society. What did she feel in that moment when the decree was granted? Was it relief? As though a door long locked had at last been opened? Was it sorrow for the failure of what once had been chosen with sincerity? Or was it something more complex, a mingling of freedom and loss, triumph and regret? The documents, brittle and dry, do not record emotions, only facts. But in imagining her face as she emerged from the courthouse, one sees not joy nor despair, but resolve. She had taken the step that few dared, and she would carry its consequences with dignity. From the desert, her path turned once again toward the city, but she was no longer the same. The woman who returned to society was not merely a mistress, nor only an actress, but a divorced woman, one who had defied both marriage and convention. This status, precarious as it was, gave her a sharper independence. She could not rely upon the shield of respectability, but she no longer desired it. Instead, she began to seek other forms of power, other stages upon which to assert herself. The freedom bought in Nevada's dry air would soon be spent in ventures bold and uncertain, from theaters to racetracks, from salons to financial dealings. The desert wind lingers still in this part of her tale, dry and sharp, carrying the faint scent of sagebrush and dust. It is the sound of papers fluttering in the courthouse, of boots upon wooden steps, of horses stamping restlessly in the heat. Against that backdrop, Lillie Langtry walked out unbound, her name forever altered by the act of dissolution. And from that whisper of law, another sound begins to rise, the rustle of banknotes, the clink of coins, the thunder of hooves upon the turf. For freedom, once secured, demands to be sustained, and she would soon turn her beauty and her notoriety into ventures of wealth and enterprise. The dry whisper of legal documents fades into memory, and in its place comes another sound, the soft rustle of banknotes being counted, the metallic clink of coins sliding across polished wood, the hum of wagers spoken in low tones. Freedom, once granted, had to be sustained, and Lillie Langtry, no longer wife and no longer merely mistress, turned her gaze to the world of money. Independence required more than applause. It required income steady enough to silence the judgments of society. Thus began her ventures into the uncertain realms of business, speculation, and the grand theater of horse racing, where fortunes were won and lost, not with words, but with the pounding of hooves upon turf. London, ever eager to watch her, did not expect such a turn. Women of beauty were meant to adorn, not to invest. They were meant to be admired, not to calculate odds. Yet Lillie had learned, from Jersey's stern lessons and Nevada's desert clarity, that admiration alone was fragile. It could lift one high, but it could not secure a future. She sought instead the solidity of wealth, though in her case even wealth was to be pursued in arenas tinged with risk. The racetrack drew her, its mixture of elegance and hazard mirroring her own life. There, beneath wide skies, crowds gathered in expectation, the smell of horses and fresh-cut grass mingling with perfume and cigar smoke. There, fortunes were staked upon the strength of muscle and the turn of chance, and there she found her new stage. She invested boldly, purchasing thoroughbreds, entering them into races. Her name now whispered not only in salons, but in stables and bookmakers' ledgers. The sight of her at the track became another spectacle, her presence turning ordinary contests into events of fascination. Some scoffed, muttering that she was out of place, a woman meddling in men's pursuits. Others admired her daring, seeing in her wagers the same fearless composure she had shown on the stage. And when her horses won, as they sometimes did, the murmurs of doubt grew quieter, replaced by reluctant respect. But the racetrack was not only about horses, it was about the theater of society itself. There, dukes and bankers rubbed shoulders with gamblers and stable boys, all united by the suspense of the race. For Lillie, who had long thrived upon navigating different circles, it was a natural arena. She could speak with princes in the morning and with trainers in the afternoon, her wit adapting to each, her presence commanding both admiration and trust. In this, she revealed a skill often overlooked, the ability to move between worlds without losing herself, to speak many languages without altering her essence. The money she earned, though not always secure, gave her a sense of agency she had long sought. She purchased properties, speculated in ventures, and managed her affairs with a shrewdness that surprised those who had dismissed her as merely ornamental. Beauty, she proved, could be capital not only in the shallow sense of attracting attention, but in the deeper sense of opening doors to opportunity. Yet beauty alone was not enough. It was her ability to turn admiration into action, whispers into wagers, that marked her as unusual. Still, the path was precarious. Just as the racetrack could crown a victor one day and strip him bare the next, her ventures carried risk. There were losses as well as gains, and the whispers of envy returned whenever fortune turned against her. Some delighted in tales of her setbacks, as though eager to see her punished for daring to step beyond her appointed role. Yet she endured, her composure steady even when the ground shook beneath her. Perhaps she had learned from the waves of Jersey and the sands of Nevada that nothing in life is constant, that all stability is illusion, and that survival lies in balance rather than certainty. It is worth pausing to reflect on the meaning of these years. For a woman of her time to invest in horses, to manage money, to take risks openly, was not merely unusual, it was radical. She was not content to live upon the charity of admirers, nor to fade into obscurity once the first bloom of scandal had passed. Instead, she sought to carve her own place, to live as though the world's boundaries could be crossed by determination alone. Was this defiance or necessity? Perhaps both. But whatever the motive, the result was the same. She became not merely a figure of fascination, but a figure of independence, one whose life hinted at possibilities others scarcely dared imagine. And always there was the sound of hooves. The thunder of horses racing down the track became the heartbeat of these years, echoing her own restless pursuit of freedom. Each race was a mirror of her life, uncertain, perilous, thrilling, decided in moments, yet remembered for years. To watch her horses run was to glimpse her own spirit running with them, proud, unyielding, straining against limits. The image that closes this part of her story is of her standing at the rail of a racetrack, her gown trailing slightly in the dust, her eyes fixed upon the field. The crowd roars as the horses near the finish, the pounding of hooves like drums in the earth, and she stands calm, composed, embodying both the risk and the poise of the wager she has placed. Around her, men shout, women lean forward, bookmakers scribble furiously, but she remains steady, as though she herself were the still point in the storm of chance. From that pounding of hooves, we move forward, for the thunder of the racetrack will soon carry us into the clamor of gambling circles, more perilous still, where cards are turned upon green tables, and where fortune whispers more seductively, only to vanish more cruelly. The thunder of hooves upon the turf grows fainter as the race concludes, the cheers of the crowd dissolving into the hum of dispersing voices. And in that soft retreat, another sound arises, the sharp flick of cards upon a green baize table, the whisper of shuffling decks, the soft clatter of ivory chips and gold coins being pushed across felt. The racetrack, with its grandeur of open fields and roaring crowds, had already accustomed Lillie Langtry to risk. But there was another arena, more intimate, more perilous, where chance ruled with an even harsher hand, the gambling tables of fashionable clubs and private houses. Here, fortune was distilled into moments, measured not in lengths of turf, but in the turning of a single card, the fall of a single die. It was said that Lillie moved with the same composure into these rooms as she had upon the stage and in the salons. The atmosphere was thick with smoke, the lamps burning low, the air heavy with anticipation and the faint metallic scent of coin. Men sat hunched, their eyes fixed upon the cards, their expressions tight with calculation, while women, less often admitted, leaned in with veils of indifference concealing hearts quickened by chance. In such settings, time itself seemed to pause, suspended upon the outcome of each deal. For Lillie, who had always walked the edge between admiration and scandal, this environment must have felt familiar. For gambling, too, is a theater of risk, a place where calm demeanor masks uncertainty, and where composure is itself a weapon. She was not reckless, not in the sense of those who sought ruin for the thrill of it. Rather, she approached gambling with the same paradoxical blend of detachment and daring that marked her life. To play was to assert control over chance, to meet fortune face to face, and neither flinch nor beg. When she won, her smile was quiet, her gratitude modest. When she lost, she bore it with the same calm, as though loss itself were another form of performance. In this way, she became as fascinating at the card table as upon the stage, her presence a spectacle even when silent. But gambling is never without cost. The tables that offered her occasional triumph also claimed their share of her wealth. Losses mounted in ways discreetly concealed, whispered about, but never openly acknowledged. There were nights when she left the table lighter in purse, her fortune diminished by the indifferent fall of cards. Yet even then, she did not retreat. Perhaps she recognized that life itself had long been a gamble, that every choice she had made, from the salons of London to the theaters of America, from the desert courts of Nevada to the racetracks of England, had been wagers upon uncertain outcomes. In this sense, the green table was not a departure from her story, but a continuation of it. There is something profoundly human in this attraction to chance, this desire to test oneself against forces that cannot be controlled. For Lillie, who had been admired for beauty she did not choose, who had been judged for scandals she could not always prevent, perhaps the gambling table offered a peculiar kind of honesty. Here, fortune did not depend on whispers or reputations, but on cards dealt blind, on dice rolled indifferently. Here she was not mistress or actress or Lillie, but simply a player, equal to all others before the law of chance. Was it, then, freedom she sought at the table, a freedom harsher and more impartial than society's gaze? The fascination of others, however, never faded. To see her seated at a gaming table was to witness a living paradox. The woman once painted as purity itself, risking all upon the turn of a card. Admirers marveled at her courage, detractors muttered of folly, but none could ignore her. Even her losses became part of her legend, proof that she dared what others would not, that she faced fortune without trembling. And yet, beneath the poise, there must have been weariness. For chance is a companion both thrilling and cruel, offering exhilaration in one moment and despair in the next. No composure, however steady, can entirely shield the heart from the sting of repeated loss. Did she ever lie awake after a night's play, staring into the dark, calculating the sums lost, feeling the faint chill of uncertainty creep into her independence? Or did she dismiss it all with the shrug of one who has already survived harsher storms? History gives us no answer, and so we are left to imagine her thoughts, suspended between courage and regret. The card tables of her time were not merely places of fortune, they were stages of society as well. To be seen there was to signal daring, to court both envy and reproach. Lillie, as ever, seemed to thrive upon such ambiguity. She did not hide her presence, nor flaunt it. She allowed it to be remarked upon, knowing that each remark, whether in admiration or disapproval, only added to her legend. For hers was a life lived in the tension between scandal and fascination, and the green baize table became one more backdrop upon which that drama played. The image that remains from these years is vivid. Lillie seated at a table, the lamplight soft upon her pale face, her gown silk whispering as she leaned slightly forward, her eyes calm upon the cards. Around her, men shift uneasily, their fingers drumming upon the felt, while she remains still, as though time itself bends to her composure. A card turns, red against green, and in that instant fortune tilts one way or the other, indifferent to beauty, indifferent to scandal. From that turning of a card, our path leads onward once more. For as cards are laid upon tables, so too are words upon pages, and in time, Lillie Langtry would turn to the pen, setting down her own recollections, shaping memory into narrative. The rustle of silk at a gaming table fades into the faint scent of ink, drying upon paper as she began to write her memoirs, weaving truth and invention into yet another performance. The turning of a card upon green baize, red against the shadowed lamplight, fades into stillness, and in its place comes another sound, the slow uncorking of an inkwell, the dip of a pen, the faint scratch of nib upon paper. Alongside that sound drifts a subtler companion, the scent of ink, sharp and metallic, rising faintly in the air as words begin to take form. For after the wagers of racetracks and gaming tables, after applause and whispers and the endless scrutiny of society, Lillie Langtry turned to the quieter gamble of memory, the composition of her memoirs. It was another stage, though this one required no curtain, no audience in the flesh, only pages upon which recollection and invention might entwine. Memoir is a peculiar art, for it pretends to preserve truth while reshaping it through the lens of the writer's desire. To write of oneself is to act again, but with pen instead of gesture, with silence instead of applause. Lillie, who had long been both observed and misinterpreted, must have felt the urge to reclaim her story, to fix upon paper some version of herself that could stand against the distortions of rumor. Yet even here, ambiguity lingers. Did she seek to confess, to reveal, to clarify? Or did she simply craft another performance, this time for posterity rather than society? The pages she composed bore the same qualities that had marked her life: charm, wit, poise, and an air of restraint that concealed as much as it disclosed. She wrote of encounters, of journeys, of the oddities of theater life, of the glitter of society, yet always with a measured hand. There were gaps, silences, omissions, the spaces where scandal might have been laid bare, but was instead veiled. These silences are as telling as the words themselves, for they suggest a woman keenly aware of the audience she addressed, unwilling to surrender fully to exposure, determined to retain control even when unveiling her past. And perhaps this is the essence of her writing, the act of control. For throughout her life she had been the subject of others' stories, painter's muse, prince's mistress, actress, gambler, scandal. In setting her hand to paper, she became, at last, author rather than character. Each sentence was a wager, not upon cards or horses, but upon memory itself, upon how posterity would judge her. In writing, she placed her own bet against time, hoping that words might preserve what gossip would otherwise distort. The act of writing must have carried its own rhythm. One can imagine her seated at a desk in a quiet room, lamplight casting shadows across the paper, the nib of her pen scratching steadily as she shaped recollections. Outside, perhaps, the city murmured with life, but within her chamber, time slowed. Each line drawn in ink was both a tether to the past and a gesture toward the future. Did she smile as she recalled triumphs, or pause, pen lifted when memory touched wounds she preferred not to reopen? Did she feel the presence of those she wrote about, the prince, her husband, her rivals, hovering over her shoulder, demanding revision, denial, or vindication? In the silence of her room, she conversed not only with paper, but with ghosts. It is worth considering the nature of memory itself. No recollection is pure. All are colored by desire, by fear, by the stories we tell ourselves to make sense of what has been. For Lillie, whose entire life had been lived under the gaze of others, memory may have been less a record than a refuge, a place where she could rearrange the pieces into a form that gave dignity to survival. Was her memoir confession or invention? Perhaps it was both, inseparable, as life and legend had always been in her story. The reception of her writings mirrored the reception of her presence. Fascination mingled with skepticism, admiration tempered by doubt. Readers devoured her words, eager for glimpses of scandal, for revelations of royal intimacy, yet found instead a composed narrative, charming but elusive. Some were disappointed, muttering that she had withheld too much. Others admired the restraint, seeing in it a continuation of the dignity she had always maintained. Either way, the memoirs accomplished their aim. They ensured that her voice, however partial, would linger beyond her presence, that she would not be remembered solely through the words of others. The image of her with pen in hand, the scent of ink rising, is one of stillness, yet also of defiance. She, who had been turned into symbol, portrait, gossip, painting, now carved herself into words, fragile yet enduring. The pages may have curled and yellowed with time, but the act itself remains significant. A woman of scandal and fame shaping her own narrative, refusing to leave her story entirely in the hands of others. And yet, even as ink dried upon paper, life did not cease around her. The world beyond the desk still pressed in, with its invitations, its admirers, its endless cycle of fascination. The memoirs were but one performance among many, and when the lamp was extinguished and the pen set aside, she returned once more to rooms filled with company, to voices and touches and laughter. For though she preserved her story in ink, she continued to live in silk and shadow, her beauty and presence still her greatest currency. Thus the scent of ink mingles with the rustle of fabric, the whisper of silk against a chair, as she entertained companions new and old. The quiet solitude of writing gave way again to the intimate theater of desire, of alliances and affections that sustained her through the years. The pen falls silent, and in its silence rises the murmur of rooms lit by candlelight, where silk stirs and memory gives way to immediacy once more. The faint scent of ink fades, and in its place rises another sensation, the rustle of silk against a chair, a fabric stirred by movement, by bodies leaning close in candle-lit rooms. For even as Lillie Langtry shaped her story with pen and paper, she continued to live it in the currency of companionship. Desire, which had once placed her in the gaze of a prince and upon the lips of society, did not abandon her in later years. Rather, it became her chosen language of survival, a means of forging alliances, of keeping her place in a world that admired beauty yet punished it the moment it ceased to dazzle. The rooms she inhabited then were softer than the harsh arenas of stage and track, filled not with the roar of crowds but with the murmur of conversation, the faint clink of glasses, the warmth of firelight upon polished wood. Within them, admirers gathered, men of wealth, of politics, of ambition, drawn not only by her beauty, which still lingered with striking power, but by her wit, her calm poise, her ability to make each listener feel as though he alone held her attention. These gatherings were private theaters, intimate salons where the performance was not in lines spoken to an audience, but in the subtle play of charm, laughter, and silence. Desire, for her, was never merely physical. It was a negotiation, a way of shaping her place within a world still uncertain how to categorize her. As a divorced woman, as an actress, as a figure of scandal, she occupied a precarious position. Respectability was forever withheld, but admiration was abundant. In that space between rejection and fascination, she carved her survival. Lovers and allies came and went, some remembered, others forgotten, but each offering some form of support, some thread woven into the fabric of her independence. To think of her only in terms of beauty is to miss the deeper truth. What drew people to her was not merely her face, however celebrated, but her presence, that elusive quality of composure and wit that made her seem untouchable even in intimacy. She could sit in a room, the rustle of her gown faint in the quiet, and with a glance or a single phrase, alter the entire atmosphere. Men who considered themselves worldly found themselves disarmed, drawn not only by desire but by curiosity, by the sense that she remained always slightly beyond their reach. This was her art, subtler than acting, more enduring than scandal, the art of being desired without ever fully surrendering, of keeping mystery alive even in closeness. Yet desire is a double-edged companion. It offers protection and power, but it also demands constant renewal. To be admired is to be scrutinized, to live under the pressure of sustaining fascination. Did she grow weary of it, in quiet hours when the voices faded and she was left alone with her thoughts? Did she ever wish for affection stripped of calculation, companionship free from the burden of performance? Or did she accept that for her, survival and desire were inseparable, that to be loved was always to be judged, and to be judged was always to be watched? Such questions remain unanswered, their silence as eloquent as any memoir. Her later affairs, discreet yet not invisible, were less about passion than about alignment. Some brought financial security, others social protection, others still the companionship of those who valued her wit as much as her charm. In these unions, fleeting or prolonged, she revealed an instinct for balance, a refusal to yield entirely, a determination to remain her own even while shared. The rustle of silk in these rooms was not only the sound of intimacy, but of negotiation, of survival written in the language of touch and gaze. And always beneath the surface, there lingered the question of time. Beauty, the gift and burden that had carried her so far, could not remain untouched by years. In the soft light of candles, in the laughter of admirers, she must have sensed its slow alteration, the subtle shifts that reminded her of mortality. Yet rather than retreat, she adapted, turning wit and intelligence into new forms of allure, allowing beauty to become memory even as charm continued to live. It was not denial, but transformation, the acceptance that desire could be sustained not only by youth, but by presence, not only by face but by spirit. The image of these years is not one of scandalous embraces nor of dramatic revelations, but of quieter moments, the sound of laughter in a half-lit room, the curve of a smile that disarmed an argument, the faint perfume lingering after she had left. Her lovers may have been many, but what endured was not the tally of names, but the impression she left upon them, the sense that in her company they had touched something rare, something composed yet alive, untouchable yet near. The silk whispers still, even now in memory. It speaks of evenings that blurred into mornings, of conversations that lingered long after words ceased, of desire not as fleeting passion, but as a thread woven through her life, binding together survival, independence, and legend. And from that whisper of fabric, the story moves again, as silk gives way to rougher textures, to the creak of wood and the cool air of twilight gardens. For as the years deepened, she began to contemplate the passing of time, to reflect upon the nature of beauty itself, and to ask what remains when charm begins to fade. The whisper of silk, warm and close, yields now to another sound altogether, the slower, more deliberate creak of wood beneath gentle motion, the rhythm of a rocking chair moving back and forth in the hush of a twilight garden. The air is cooler here, scented not with perfume but with earth and the faint sweetness of flowers, the kind of scent that carries both comfort and melancholy. In this quiet, far from the laughter of salons and the applause of theaters, Lillie Langtry began to face what no beauty, however celebrated, can avoid: the slow passage of time, the question of what remains when charm begins to fade. She was no longer the luminous figure who had first startled London with her pale gown and clear eyes. Years of triumph and scandal had passed, and though her presence retained power, it was altered, softened by age. Beauty does not vanish at once. Like a candle snuffed, it dims gradually, shifting into new forms, visible in poise, in expression, in memory, more than in skin. For Lillie, who had been so long defined by admiration, the recognition of this change must have come with a peculiar poignancy. To look into a mirror and see not only oneself, but the remembered gaze of thousands, this is a burden few could bear lightly. And yet, she did not shrink from reflection. Those who saw her in later years remarked that she carried herself with the same composure, that she wore her age with dignity, as though it too were a garment she had chosen. She did not attempt to mimic youth, nor did she retreat into obscurity. Instead, she found in age a new kind of allure, one rooted less in appearance than in presence, less in the curve of her face than in the steadiness of her spirit. In the creak of the rocking chair, in the stillness of evening gardens, one imagines her contemplating not loss, but transformation. Beauty, she may have realized, is never wholly one's own. It belongs as much to those who gaze upon it as to the one who bears it. Throughout her life, she had been made into symbol and story, turned into an image by artists and admirers alike. Now, as her features changed, she reclaimed a portion of herself, for admiration rooted in memory is less demanding than admiration rooted in immediacy. In memory, she could live untouchable, preserved as the Jersey lily. In the present, she could become something else, a woman seasoned by experience, no longer captive to scandal, no longer wholly dependent upon charm. There is a peculiar grace in such acceptance. Many resist age fiercely, clinging to the fading bloom with desperation. Lillie, however, seemed to move with it, as though she had long understood that nothing in her life had been fixed, that all stages were performances, and all performances must eventually close. To embrace age was to step into another role, one she played with the same calm dignity as those before. Was there sorrow in it? Surely. To have lived so long in the light of admiration is to feel its dimming keenly. But perhaps there was also relief, for the demands of constant fascination are heavy, and the quiet of twilight offers rest no applause can provide. The rocking chair, moving steadily, seems itself a metaphor. Back and forth, forward and back, it mirrors memory, which drifts between past and present, between what was and what is. In its creak, one hears the laughter of salons, the applause of theaters, the murmur of admirers, all softened by distance. Each motion carries both regret and gratitude, the sense that life, however tumultuous, has been lived fully. And in the garden around her, the flowers bloom and fade, their cycles echoing her own, reminding her that beauty is not a possession but a season. Those who visited her in these later years often remarked on her conversation. She remained lively, her wit intact, her stories colored with charm. Yet beneath the sparkle lay reflection, the wisdom of one who had seen admiration in its many guises and who understood its impermanence. She spoke not only of triumphs but of costs, not only of lovers but of solitude, not only of wealth but of the fragility of fortune. In such conversations, the woman behind the lily emerged more clearly, no longer only an emblem but a person marked by time. It is worth pausing to consider what beauty means when it no longer dazzles. Does it vanish, or does it take on another form, subtler but no less real? In Lillie's case, beauty became memory, dignity, and presence. Those who had once adored her for her face now admired her for her composure, for the way she carried her years without apology. In this sense, she revealed a truth too often overlooked, that beauty is not a surface, but a bearing, not merely a feature, but a way of being. And yet, even in twilight, admiration lingered. The legend of the Jersey lily did not fade, for memory preserves what time erodes. Artists still spoke of her, admirers still recalled her presence, society still whispered her name with fascination. She had outlived many who once judged her, and in doing so, she became not merely scandalous or beautiful, but enduring. The rocking chair creaked on, steady as the passage of seasons, and she sat within it, neither clinging nor surrendering, but balanced, as she had always been, upon the narrow edge between admiration and survival. The twilight garden grows quiet now, the last birds calling faintly, the air cooling as night descends. The creak of the chair slows, pauses, fades, and from that stillness another sound begins, the hush of distant waves breaking upon a shore, the Mediterranean murmuring softly beneath the stars. For her later years would carry her away once more into exile of a gentler kind, to Monaco and the Riviera, where wealth, solitude, and dignity wove the final chapters of her life. The twilight garden grows still, the creak of the rocking chair fading, and in its place comes the soft, steady hush of waves folding against a distant shore. Not the harsh surf of Jersey, nor the cold mists of England, but the gentler waters of the Mediterranean, where nights are warmed by breezes carrying the scent of salt and blossoms, and where stars hang low, as though nearer to the earth. It was to this world that Lillie Langtry retreated in her later years, to Monaco, to the Riviera, to an exile of her own choosing, if exile it may be called, for it was gilded, comfortable, and softened by the dignity of age. Monaco in those days was already a place of paradox, both a haven and a spectacle, where wealth displayed itself openly in the glitter of casinos and in the opulence of villas perched above the sea. For Lillie, who had known the scrutiny of London and the vastness of America, it was a setting both restful and theatrical. Here she could live without the relentless chatter of English society, yet remain within a world that still valued her name, her legend, her presence. In Monte Carlo, she was no longer the center of scandal, but a figure of fascination preserved, a woman whose story had already entered history even as she still lived it. She acquired a villa, elegant yet not ostentatious, its windows opening onto the sea. From its terraces, she could watch the water shift in shades of blue and silver, hear the gulls cry against the cliffs, feel the warmth of the southern sun upon her skin. These were days measured less by the urgency of ambition than by the rhythms of seasons, of visitors, of letters arriving from abroad. The Mediterranean air seemed to soothe her, the hush of waves providing a counterpoint to the applause and whispers that had filled her earlier life. Yet even in this quieter setting, the performance of dignity remained. She received guests, entertained acquaintances, and maintained her presence in society, though now with the air of one who no longer needed to strive. Admirers still came, eager to glimpse the woman who had once enchanted a prince and captivated a continent. They found her gracious, poised, her wit intact, her beauty softened but enduring. She had aged, yes, but with a dignity that itself became another form of allure. Age, which might have diminished another, seemed to lend her a new authority, as though she had at last transcended the need to be merely admired. In Monte Carlo, the casino stood at the heart of life, its lamps burning late into the night, its rooms filled with the murmur of players, the clatter of chips, the rustle of gowns. Lillie was no stranger to such halls. She walked among them not as a desperate gambler, but as a presence, observed, respected, whispered about. The sight of her seated at a table recalled earlier years, yet now it carried another weight. Not scandal, but legend. She was both participant and symbol, both woman and story, her very presence reminding others that beauty and notoriety can endure, transfigured by time into myth. Her wealth, though fluctuating, was sufficient to maintain comfort. Investments in property, in ventures, and the remnants of earnings from her tours had given her stability. She was not dependent upon the favor of others, as she once had been, nor did she crave it. Instead, she seemed to live with a quiet pride in her independence, in the knowledge that she had navigated storms that might have destroyed another, and that she had arrived, battered perhaps, but intact, upon this gentler shore. But solitude cannot be banished entirely, not even by wealth or admiration. In the hush of Mediterranean nights when the waves folded endlessly upon themselves and the villa lay silent, she must have felt the absence of those who had once filled her life. The prince, her companions, her rivals. So many were gone, their voices stilled, their scandals forgotten. To outlive one's own legend is to walk among ghosts, to remember what others have already ceased to recall. Did she find comfort in the silence, or did it weigh upon her, a reminder that applause fades even if names endure? Perhaps both, for she had always lived at the edge of paradox, finding balance between admiration and loss. The Riviera offered its own companionship, of course. New acquaintances, younger admirers, old friends who sought the warmth of its sun. Yet none could quite fill the space of what had been. And so, she carried herself with dignity, entertaining when required, withdrawing when desired, allowing memory to be both solace and burden. The waves outside her villa, constant and unjudging, became her truest companions, their rhythm echoing the long arc of her life. It is striking to imagine her walking along the promenade at dusk, the sea glowing with the last light of day, her gown trailing softly, her figure still upright, her gaze steady. Passers-by, recognizing her, would whisper her name, not as scandal now, but as legend, as though speaking of a figure half-remembered from another age. To live thus, both present and already historical, is a rare and lonely fate, and yet perhaps there was contentment. For what is dignity, if not the acceptance of one's own story, the refusal to deny or to apologize, the calm endurance of both admiration and silence? In Monaco, in her villa by the sea, Lillie Langtry seemed to embody this dignity. living not as the scandalous Jersey Lillie of her youth, but as a woman who had endured and who now chose peace. The hush of Mediterranean waves continues, steady and unbroken, lulling the villa into sleep, carrying her story further into the night. And from that hush rises another sound, fainter but deeper, the tolling of a distant church bell, a reminder that even legends must yield to time, that every life, however luminous, bends at last toward its close. The hush of Mediterranean waves lies steady beneath the night, and through it drifts another sound, deeper and more solemn, the tolling of a distant church bell, its resonance carrying over the rooftops and across the water. Each strike lingers in the air like a reminder that even amid wealth and comfort, time continues its slow procession. For Lillie Langtry, the bell was not merely a call to prayer or ritual. It was an echo of mortality, a signal that she had outlived many who had once defined her story. Companions of youth, rivals of salons, admirers who once crowded theaters, all had faded into memory, leaving her with the peculiar solitude of one who endures beyond her own legend. To outlive one's contemporaries is both a gift and a burden. It grants the freedom to reflect without interruption, to hold memories that belong only to oneself, unshared by others. Yet it also sharpens the silence, for conversations once lively are now one-sided, their voices absent, their gestures preserved only in recollection. Lillie, seated upon her terrace overlooking the Mediterranean, must have felt this paradox keenly. The sea that stretched before her was eternal, yet the faces she remembered, Edward, her husband, her admirers, her rivals, were gone, leaving her as their witness. The legend of the Jersey Lillie still lingered in the world beyond her villa. Newspapers occasionally recalled her name, photographs still circulated, admirers who had once seen her in her prime spoke of her with softened reverence. Yet such echoes are faint compared to the immediacy of a life once lived in applause. To be remembered while still alive is to feel oneself both present and already absent, both flesh and story. Did she take comfort in knowing that her name endured, or did she feel the sting of realizing that memory had already overtaken presence, that people spoke of her as though she were a relic of a vanished age? In the quiet of those Riviera nights, she must have returned often to memories of her youth, the windswept cliffs of Jersey, the black gown that startled London, the candle-lit salons, the secret doors closing softly, the thunder of applause, the rumble of trains across America, the dry whisper of Nevada's desert air. Each memory carried with it not only triumph, but also loss. For every gain in her life had come at a price: respectability for freedom, privacy for fame, fortune for risk. To reflect upon such a life is to see not only the heights, but also the costs hidden beneath them. Perhaps she asked herself questions without clear answers. Was it worth it to have been so admired, so whispered about, so scrutinized? Did the independence she carved justify the sacrifices it demanded? Or was it all, in the end, a fleeting performance, no more enduring than the applause that once filled the theaters? The church bell, tolling its solemn notes, might have seemed to ask the same questions, each strike a reminder that time judges all performances equally, that legends too dissolve into silence. And yet there is another way of seeing. To outlive one's legend is not only to face solitude, it is also to gain perspective. In her later years, Lillie spoke not with bitterness, but with calm, her stories laced with wit, her presence still carrying grace. She seemed to understand that to have been a legend at all is a rare fate, one granted to few. The admiration may have waned, the scandals may have faded, but the fact that her name endured at all was itself a triumph. Many lived respectable lives unnoticed, their stories vanishing with them. She, however, remained a subject of fascination even in twilight, her legend woven into the fabric of her age. The bell tolls again, and with it comes the weight of absence. Edward, the prince who had once leaned toward her with fascination, was gone. Her rivals, those who once gossiped behind fans and painted themselves with envy, were gone. Even Edward Langtry, the husband from whom she had parted, had long since vanished into the obscurity of death. She, who had once been the subject of whispers in every salon, now sat among ghosts. But perhaps she did not see this as loneliness, but as testimony. For to carry the memory of others is to grant them continued existence. And in that role she became not only legend, but custodian of a vanished world. The Mediterranean night stretched long, the air soft, the waves unchanging, the bell tolling at intervals that seemed both eternal and brief. In those hours one imagines her gazing outward, her thoughts drifting like the tide between past and present, between what had been and what would soon end. Solitude was her companion, but solitude too carries its dignity. In silence she found not emptiness, but reflection, not despair, but acceptance. The image of her in these years is less of spectacle and more of stillness, seated by an open window, the sea beyond, the bell sounding faintly, her face illuminated by lamplight softened with age. She is neither the young mistress nor the dazzling actress, neither the gambler nor the businesswoman, but something beyond them all, a survivor, a witness, a figure who endured when so many others had faded. The church bell tolls once more, its sound folding into the night air, mingling with the hush of waves. And from that solemn resonance emerges another sound, quieter yet final, the fall of earth upon wood, the muted thud that marks the closing of a life. For even Lillie Langtry, who outlived her contemporaries and her legend, could not outlive time itself. The story now bends toward its ending, toward Monte Carlo and the grave where the Jersey Lily was laid to rest. The tolling of the church bell fades into silence, and in that silence comes another sound, softer, more final, the muted thud of earth falling upon wood. It is the sound that marks the end of all journeys, the sound that transforms presence into memory, flesh into story. In Monte Carlo, where she had sought rest and dignity in her later years, Lillie Langtry came at last to her close. The Jersey Lily, once the most admired woman of London, once the mistress of a prince, once the actress who carried her legend across oceans, was laid into the earth beneath Mediterranean skies. Her final years had been lived with relative quiet, though never without the aura of fascination that had followed her all her life. Even as age softened her features and slowed her steps, she remained to visitors an emblem of a vanished age, the living echo of the Victorian world with all its contradictions, its hunger for beauty, its thirst for scandal, its rigid respectability, forever challenged by those who dared step beyond its bounds. In Monaco, she was still received, still remembered, still spoken of with reverence and curiosity. Yet the intensity of youth had gone, replaced by a kind of solemn dignity, a recognition that her story was already being written into history even before her death. She passed away in 1929 at the age of 75 in the villa that had looked out so long upon the sea. The news of her death traveled swiftly, carried in newspapers across England, America, and beyond. The reports spoke of her beauty, her scandals, her independence. Some called her a pioneer, others a survivor, others still simply a legend of her time. The words varied, but the sense was the same, that a figure larger than life had at last yielded to the common fate of all. Her funeral in Monte Carlo was attended with a solemnity that belied the scandal of her youth. Admirers and acquaintances gathered, the Mediterranean sun casting long shadows as her coffin was lowered. Flowers lay upon the earth, lilies among them, their pale petals curling in the warmth. The sound of earth upon wood was softened by the murmur of waves below the cliffs, as though the sea itself offered its requiem. She had lived among applause and whispers, but she was buried in silence, the kind of silence that enfolds without judgment. What does it mean to die after such a life? For some, it is the closing of a tale of scandal. For others, the conclusion of a legend. But for Lillie, perhaps it was simply rest, the end of the constant gaze, the release from the endless performance. Death, impartial as fortune, does not ask whether one was admired or condemned. It falls upon all with equal hand. Yet in her case, it carried with it the weight of memory, for few lives had been so entangled with the imagination of an age. It is worth reflecting that she died not in England, the land of her fame, nor in Jersey, the island of her birth, but in Monte Carlo, that peculiar city of chance, luxury, and exile. In that setting, her life seems to have come full circle, from the waves of Jersey to the desert of Nevada, from the racetrack to the gaming table, from salons to theaters. Her story had always been bound to risk and performance. To end in Monte Carlo, with its casinos and its Mediterranean hush, was fitting, as though chance itself had been her final companion. Those who stood by her grave may have asked themselves what they mourned. Was it the woman with her laughter, her wit, her presence? Was it the legend, the Jersey Lillie, whose beauty once silenced rooms? Or was it something more elusive, the passing of an age itself, the vanishing of the world of salons, carriages, and whispered scandals into the pages of history? Perhaps they mourned all these at once, for in her story the Victorian age seemed embodied, its fascination with beauty, its hunger for gossip, its uneasy dance between propriety and desire. The earth continued to fall, soft thuds against the coffin, each strike final yet strangely tender. Around her, mourners bowed their heads, the Mediterranean breeze stirring their garments, the waves below folding endlessly against the rocks. And when the last clods of earth were placed, when the flowers lay scattered upon the mound, silence returned. It was not the silence of scandal, nor of solitude, but the deep silence that belongs to endings, a silence that allows memory to begin its work. And so, the Jersey Lillie lay beneath Monte Carlo's soil, her story complete in the world of flesh, but continuing in the world of remembrance. She had been beauty and scandal, actress and gambler, mistress and memoirist, adored and condemned, admired and doubted. Above all, she had endured, shaping herself again and again amid the shifting tides of fortune. The sound of earth upon her coffin was not the sound of oblivion, but of transition, from life lived under the gaze of many to memory carried by all who speak her name. The thud of earth lingers in imagination, fading into silence. And from that silence rises not another sound, but a question, unanswerable, yet compelling. What do we remember when we remember her? The scandals? The beauty? The courage? Or simply the mystery of survival itself? The question remains as the story bends toward its final reflection, where memory and legend intertwine, and where the Jersey Lillie continues to bloom, not in gardens of earth, but in the minds of those who recall her. The sound of earth falling upon a coffin fades into silence, the mound of soil smoothed, the flowers resting quietly above, their petals trembling in the Mediterranean breeze. Out of this silence comes not a sound, but a pause, a space in which memory begins to take its shape. For when a life ends, it does not vanish. It lingers, it shifts, it is retold, and in the retelling, it is remade. So it was with Lillie Langtry, the Jersey Lillie, who lay beneath Monte Carlo's sky, while her name continued to travel far beyond that quiet grave. What, then, remains of her? Some remembered her only as beauty, the woman whose face startled London in a simple black gown, whose eyes silenced rooms, whose presence enchanted a prince. To them, she was emblem rather than person, a flower admired but untouchable, her life reduced to an image. Others remembered scandal, whispering of the mistress of Edward, the woman whose name became entangled with gossip and disapproval, the living paradox of purity and temptation. Still others spoke of her as pioneer, a woman who seized her own agency, who stepped upon the stage, who turned notoriety into independence, who endured in a world that sought to diminish her. Each of these memories is true, yet none are complete. Her life was not a single story, but many, overlapping, contradicting, entwined. She was the island child listening to waves upon Jersey's rocks, the young wife inhaling the sharp scent of drying oil paint, the mistress walking calmly beside a prince, the actress bowing beneath theater lights, the traveler crossing America by train, the woman in Nevada standing in desert air as papers dissolved her marriage, the gambler leaning over cards, the businesswoman at the racetrack, the memoirist dipping her pen, the hostess whose silk gowns whispered in candle-lit rooms, the elder woman rocking in twilight gardens, the exile gazing upon the Mediterranean. To reduce her to one of these would be to miss the fullness of her performance. And perhaps that is the lesson her story leaves, that life is not singular, not easily categorized, but layered like the waves themselves, each rising, breaking, and folding into the next. She was never only beauty, never only scandal, never only survivor. She was all of these, and more besides. To speak of her is to enter ambiguity, to embrace the possibility that truth and legend are inseparable, that survival often demands reinvention, and that reinvention itself is a kind of art. The question remains, how do we measure such a life? By the applause of theaters, by the whispers of salons, by the wealth won and lost at racetracks and tables, by the memoirs she wrote, or by the silences she kept? Or do we measure it by the simple fact that she endured, that she continued to shape herself even when scandal threatened to destroy her, even when beauty began to fade, even when memory overtook presence? Perhaps survival itself is her legacy, the refusal to be undone, the determination to remain a figure in motion when others sought to confine her. One can imagine her now, not beneath the soil, but walking once more along the cliffs of Jersey, her gown lifted slightly by the wind, her eyes upon the horizon, or seated at a card table, her expression calm as a card is turned, or standing at center stage, the curtain falling as the applause rises. These images, layered and shifting, remain in the imagination, for legends do not die as bodies do. They linger, they echo, they transform. The Jersey lily, though long laid to rest, continues to bloom in memory, not as fragile flower, but as enduring emblem of beauty, scandal, and resilience. And so we return to the question with which we began. What do we remember when we speak her name? Do we recall the prince, the salons, the applause, the scandal? Do we recall the independence, the survival, the reinvention? Or do we recall only the mystery, the unanswered silence that lies at the heart of all legends? There is no final answer, nor should there be, for ambiguity is what keeps memory alive, what prevents it from closing, what allows the story to continue being told. The Mediterranean waves still hush against the shore. The bell has long since ceased to toll. The flowers upon her grave have withered and been replaced, withered and replaced again. Yet the name remains, spoken softly, remembered dimly, revived in stories such as this. And as you listen now, perhaps in your own twilight, perhaps in the stillness before sleep, her presence lingers once more, not as scandal nor as saint, but as voice, as image, as question. What remains of Lillie Langtry? Only what we choose to carry. Only the whispers, the applause, the shadows, the light. Only the mystery of a life lived upon edges, neither wholly admired nor wholly condemned, but always, unmistakably, alive. The waves hush once more, steady and eternal, and into their rhythm the story dissolves, leaving the question unresolved, left for you to drift upon as you close your eyes and surrender to sleep.